Reconstruction, there were three main issues. How would they deal with the 4 million freedmen? How would they treat the defeated South? And would Congress and the President control the Reconstruction? During Lincoln's presidency, he proposed plans that dealt with reuniting the Union, being sympathetic with the South. He, however, did not address the status of the freedmen. His main concern was to preserve the Union at all costs. After Lincoln was assassinated, Johnson became president and created his own plan for Reconstruction. Johnson's plan was similar to Lincoln's, but he refused to give the freedmen civil rights. Johnson and Congress were always in disagreement. Congress addressed their own plans, which mainly dealt with the civil rights of the freedmen. All three plans were similar in their basis, but wholeheartedly differently as well.
President Lincoln wanted to get states' governments in operation before Congress met in order to avoid persecution of the radical Republicans. Lincoln wanted each state to have a Republican government. The Proclamation of Amnesty said that all Southerners could be pardoned and reinstated as U.S. citizens if they took on an oath of allegiance to the Constitution and Union and pledged to abide by emancipation. The 10% plan was very critical in Lincoln's overall plan.
Go.
Lincoln was the foremost advocate for being the most lenient on the South. His 10% plan was a model for reinstatement of the Southern states. It decreed that a state could be reintegrated into the Union when 10% of the 1860 vote count from that state had taken an oath of allegiance to the U.S. and pledged to abide by emancipation. This policy was meant to shorten the war by offering a moderate peace plan.
In review, Lincoln's 10% plan meant that 10% of the voting population in each state had to take an ironclad oath to the Union before the state government could be approved by the Union and retaken into the United States. There were two groups of Republicans: the Radicals, who rejected the plan because they believed it would restore the Southern aristocracy and involve the re-enslavement of blacks, and the moderates. The Radicals passed the Wade-Davis bill, which said 50% of white males had to take an oath of allegiance before states could call a constitutional convention, and they had to abolish slavery completely. But this bill was pocket vetoed by Lincoln, which means it was vetoed because Congress was unable to get the bill passed before the end of session. Soon after, Lincoln was assassinated, and Johnson and his new plan came into place. Johnson was very similar to Lincoln on his stance on Reconstruction. Both him and Lincoln would be called moderates. Johnson recognized the 10% plan that Lincoln proposed, but for citizens individually, he decided to pardon all of those who took the oath, except for high-ranking Southern officials. For these specific officials, Johnson asked that they apply to Johnson himself. After these oaths, after taking the oaths to create a government, states had to do three things to re-enter. Number one, ratify the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. Number two, deny or reject the ordinances of secession. And number three, repudiate Confederate debt. One of the major flaws or major reasons of tension with Johnson and Congress was that Johnson failed to promote the rights of the freedmen. Although it is said that much of Johnson's plan created tension with Congress, his initial goal made them very happy. In addition to some of the other policies, he decided to disenfranchise all former military and civil officers of the South, and as well as those worth more than $20,000. His goal was to shift the political control of the South from the old planted aristocracy to small farmers and artisans. And this was very much appreciated by the radical Republicans in Congress. But the main reason of their anger with him came from his decision not to give rights to freedmen. He argued that the power of suffrage resided with the states and not the federal government, and thus made no laws for or against it. As Johnson furthered his plan, tension between him and Congress only grew. Johnson allowed old Confederate Southern leaders to run for congressional positions, and some actually won in Southern districts. Congress and radical Republicans took great offense to this action and didn't allow those elected representatives, a seat during the Congressional Convention in December of that year. As the president's leniency towards Southerners grew, former secessionists became more and more arrogant, asking for more and more, and expecting less and less to be punished. And the schism between Congress and Johnson only grew bigger.
The Joint Committee on Reconstruction was formed in 1856. They rejected Johnson's presidential plan. They denied the seating of the Southern legislatures in Congress because they believed the Southern states had forfeited all their rights when they seceded from the Union. Radical Republicans thought that they should be the ones in charge of Reconstruction. Johnson wanted to get rid of the Freedmen's Bureau because they were no longer in war, and he thought that it was unconstitutional. But this was overridden by Congress and extended to the black population. The Civil Rights Bill was passed in 1866, and this granted American citizenship to blacks and denied states the power to restrict the blacks' rights. This was also vetoed by Johnson, but overridden by Congress. They passed the 14th Amendment, which ties into the Civil Rights Bill and acknowledged the rights of the blacks.
Go.
Congress passed the Military Reconstruction Act in 1867, which was established new conditions under which the Southern governments would be formed. This was the result of the states refusing to ratify the 14th Amendment. They divided the Confederacy into 5 military districts, each with a Union general, in order to maintain order and the civil rights of the people. The Southern states were also forced to ratify the 14th Amendment. They adopted new state constitutions guaranteeing the blacks their right to vote in order for their representatives to be admitted to Congress and military rule to end. All the states needed to have Republican regimes in order for the federal troops to be removed from the South.
In 1870, Congress passed the 15th Amendment. This prohibited the states from denying anyone the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This did not address female suffrage, and literacy tests, poll taxes, intimidation, and lynching were all often used to keep blacks from voting. Full suffrage for blacks was not realized until 1965. In 1875, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. This prohibited racial discrimination. This did not, however, guarantee equality in schools, churches, and cemeteries. It lacked a strong reinforcement mechanism and was never totally recognized.
To go back to what we talked about earlier, Lincoln's plan was one of leniency towards the South. He thought of the South as a little brother that deserved the love of the Union again and was willing to let them back in with minimal punishment. His 10% plan was the focus of him and Johnson's plan, but if he had not been assassinated, he would have attempted to keep the Union together and do that in any way possible, which was he thought the best way was by letting the South in without any punishment. Johnson, on the other hand, was very similar to Lincoln's plan. He also wanted to keep in the 10% plan, but instead of trying to do whatever it took in terms of freedmen to keep the Union together, Johnson was an advocate for not giving freedmen rights. He made the claim that it was in the states' powers to grant suffrage, not the federal government, and therefore he would not address it. And this angered the Congress very much, seen as they were infested with radical Republicans. Their stance on the issue was to punish the South for their actions of leaving and betrayal, and at the same time not only free blacks from slavery, but give them full civil rights such as suffrage and other things. The main similarities were obviously between Johnson and Lincoln's plan, seeing as they were both considered moderate plans, but while the principal difference was between congressional and Johnson's plan, which eventually led to his impeachment process.